Hello and welcome back to London's Dark Archives. On this channel we delve into London's shadowy past, uncovering both the infamous tales you've heard of and hidden stories you might not know. I release new videos roughly every week, so if this sounds like your kind of thing, why not hit that subscribe button. Now settle in and prepare to journey into the dark corners of history. But before we begin, a quick word of caution. This episode contains sensitive content, including discussions of violent crimes and disturbing details which some viewers may find upsetting. Please consider this before watching. Welcome to the grim tale of John Reginald Christie. A story so horrifying it's etched itself into the darkest annals of British crime. The name 10 Rillington Place has become synonymous with his unspeakable acts, a byword for deceit, manipulation and murder. This story is not for the faint-hearted, but for those who seek to understand the depths of human depravity. It serves as a chilling cautionary tale. While we'll explore Christie's heinous crimes, this narrative will avoid unnecessary vulgarity or sensationalism. Instead, I'll focus on the factual horrors that unfolded in a place once considered just another address in a working-class neighbourhood. Our timeline stretches across the first half of the 20th century, encompassing the chaos and devastation of two world wars. It's set mostly in Notting Hill, an area at the time bore little resemblance to the vibrant, affluent district it is today. Back then, it was a world of poverty and grime, where rationing and rebuilding were part of daily life, a setting that played a key role in this tale of death and despair. This is the story of how one man, under the guise of respectability, exploited trust, wielded power and committed atrocities that shocked the nation. Today, Notting Hill is known for its colourful houses, iron boutiques and as the backdrop of romantic films. Yet in the late 1940s, it was an entirely different place, a world of decay and despair. The streets were filled with tightly packed houses, many of which had fallen into ruin. This was a neighbourhood battered by time and neglect, its grand Victorian homes stripped of their original grandeur and carved into overcrowded, poorly maintained flats. The area had been in decline for decades, but the Second World War dealt a final blow. Bombing raids had left scars on the landscape, with some houses reduced to rubble and others patched up just enough to remain barely habitable. Wartime austerity compounded the misery, as building supplies were scarce and landlords focused on squeezing every last penny from their tenants and rarely spent money on repairs. The streets smelt of damp and rot, with peeling paint and crumbling brickwork a common sight. Notting Hill had become a refuge for those with few options: working class families, newly arrived immigrants and those just down on their luck. Many of the residents worked long hours in factories, on construction sites or as domestic servants, earning meagre wages that barely covered their rent. Some turned to more desperate means, supplementing their income with odd jobs or black market dealings. Post-war Britain was a place of ration books and rebuilding, and for the people of Notting Hill, every day was a battle to make ends meet. The cramped conditions of the flats were a breeding ground for disease and despair. Families of 4 or 5 might live in a single room, sharing a mattress on the floor. With no indoor bathrooms, tenants relied on shared outdoor toilets, often located at the end of a muddy yard. For washing, they used to use a tin bath or simply make do with a bucket of water. In the winter, flats were bitterly cold, their drafty windows let in the chill, while in the summertime the air grew stifling and foul. It was against this grim backdrop we find ourselves on a narrow, unremarkable street named Rillington Place, just off of Ladbroke Grove. It was a street of terraced houses, flanked by the constant rattle of the Metropolitan line trains. The tracks, which run just above ground nearby, brought deafening noise day and night, their relentless clatter echoing through the neighbourhood. For the residents of Rillington Place, the railway was a constant companion, a reminder that life in this bit of London never offered much peace or quiet. At the end of this grim little street was number 10, and now split into 2 flats, each containing a bedroom, a scullery and a small kitchen. Conditions inside was appalling. The walls were damp and stained, the floors worn thin by decades of footsteps, and the furnishings sparse and shabby. The air inside the house was musty and oppressive, carrying a faint stench from the shared outside toilet in the yard. The kitchen sculleries were rudimentary at best, with little more than a chip sink and an ancient gas stove. The windows let in barely any light, giving the rooms a gloomy and claustrophobic feel. The house itself seemed to absorb the misery of its occupants, becoming a silent witness to their struggles. Its worn-out interior matched the weariness of the lives lived within its walls. Yet for all its bleakness, number 10 Rillington Place held a far darker secret, an horror waiting to be uncovered, as the facade of normality concealed the chilling deeds of one man. John Reginald Christie was born on the 8th of April 1899 near Halifax in Yorkshire. The sixth of 7 children, his father Ernest was a strict and emotionless man whose cold demeanour left a lasting impression on Christie. In contrast, his mother and sisters coddled him, though their attention was unpredictable, sometimes veering into teasing or bullying. This volatile family dynamic seemed to shape Christie's deeply conflicted view of women and authority. One pivotal moment in Christie's childhood occurred when his grandfather died. The family laid out the body in the house, a common practice at the time. Seeing his once feared grandfather laying still and powerless gave Christie an odd sense of control and well-being, a reaction that hinted at his unsettling psychological tendencies. Despite his tumultuous home life, Christie was a bright kid with an IQ of 128. However, his intelligence did little to endear him to his peers. He was socially awkward, quiet, and considered peculiar. His schoolmates teased him for his impotence, cruelly dubbing him "Can't do it Christie." This humiliation stayed with him and lightly fuelled his lifelong struggle with feelings of inadequacy. In April 1917, Christie was called up for military service in the First World War. In 1918, while serving as a signalman with the Duke of Wellington's regiment in France, he suffered a mustard gas attack that left him temporarily blind and mute for 3 years. This incident permanently affected his voice, rendering it weak and high-pitched, a trait that made him appear unthreatening but added to his social difficulties. Christie was demobbed in 1919, later joining the RAF in 1923, only to be discharged shortly after. In 1920, he married Ethel Simpson, but the union was fraught with difficulties, including his ongoing impotence and infidelities. The couple separated for 4 years, during which Christie moved to London. By the early 1920s, Christie began a string of petty crimes. In 1921, he was imprisoned for stealing postal orders while working as a postman. Over the next decade, he was convicted multiple times for fraud, theft, and violent conduct, serving various sentences in prisons such as HMP Manchester and Wandsworth. In 1929, Christie attacked his then partner Maud Cole with a cricket bat, further highlighting his violent tendencies. By 1934, after another prison stint, he reunited with Ethel and the couple moved to 10 Rillington Place in 1937. Despite his criminal record, Christie was accepted into the Reserve Police Force during the Second World War. Working at Arrow Road Police Station, he exuded an air of authority that masked his past. During his time, he began an affair with a colleague called Gladys Jones, which ended violently when her husband returned from the war and discovered them. The husband physically confronted Christie and beat him badly, an incident that further deepened Christie's feelings of humiliation and inadequacy. Christie's first known murder was of Ruth First, a 21-year-old Austrian munitions worker who occasionally engaged in sex work. On the 24th of August 1943, while his wife was visiting family, Christie invited Ruth to his home under the guise of soliciting her services. After their encounter, he impulsively strangled her with a rope in his bedroom. Ruth's body was initially hidden under the floorboards before Christie buried her in the garden late at night. This act marked the beginning of his descent into calculated, predatory behaviour. Shortly after Ruth's murder, Christie resigned from the Reserve Police Force, and by 1944 he found work at a radio factory in Acton. It was there he met his second victim, Muriel Amelia Edie, a colleague suffering from bronchitis. On the 7th of October 1944, Christie invited Muriel to his flat, promising her an homemade remedy to cure her condition. Using his knowledge of chemicals, Christie concocted a mixture of Fry's balsam to mask the smell of domestic gas. As Muriel inhaled the mixture through a tube, Christie added coal gas, a substance rich in carbon monoxide, rendering her unconscious. Then he strangled her and buried her next to the roof in his garden. Christie's crimes were not driven by impulse alone, they were calculated and reflected his need for dominance. His early experiences, bullying, sexual dysfunction and feelings of powerlessness manifested in acts of control over vulnerable individuals. His ability to mask his predatory nature behind a mild-mannered and unassuming exterior allowed him to operate unnoticed. The victims, Ruth and Muriel, were young women trying to survive the hardships of wartime Britain. Ruth, an immigrant, and Muriel, a working-class factory employee, likely saw Christie as an harmless, even helpful figure, unaware of the dangers lurking beneath his quiet demeanour. Born in Merthyr Tydfil, Wales on the 20th of November 1924, Timothy John Evans had a difficult upbringing. His father abandoned the family before Timothy was born, leaving his mother to raise him and his siblings in poverty. Timothy struggled with illiteracy and was known for being a fantasist, often telling grandiose, fabricated stories. Despite his limitations, he worked various labour jobs, though his impulsive nature often got him into trouble. Evans was known for having a volatile temper and an inclination towards excessive drinking, which sometimes exacerbated his difficulties in life. Timothy's physical health was also poor. He suffered from tubercular foot in his childhood, leaving him with a permanent limp. These disadvantages compounded his already challenging existence, making him a tragic figure in this grim tale. Beryl Susanna Forley, born on May 19, 1927 in London, had a far more stable upbringing compared to Timothy. Raised in a working-class family, Beryl was known to be outgoing and sociable. However, like many women of her time, her options in life were limited by the social expectations of the post-war era. The couple married in September 1947 when Timothy was 23 and Beryl just 20. Their relationship was tempestuous from the start, marred by frequent arguments, financial instability and Timothy's inability to hold down steady employment. Despite these struggles, they seemed eager to start a family and moved into the top floor flat of 10 Rillington Place in the spring of 1948. Shortly after settling into their new home, Beryl gave birth to their daughter Geraldine in October 1948. Life at 10 Rillington Place was bleak. The building was decrepit with peeling wallpaper, shared facilities and a pervasive smell of damp and decay. Despite these grim surroundings, the Evans family sought to carve out a semblance of normality. However, their relationship deteriorated further, with financial difficulties and constant arguments over money adding to the strain. By late 1949, Beryl found herself pregnant again. Fearful of the financial burden of another child, she sought to get an abortion, which was illegal in Britain at the time. Tragically, this decision brought the Evanses into deeper contact with their downstairs neighbour, John Christie. Christie, posing as a man with medical knowledge, claimed he could assist with the termination. On November 30th, 1949, Timothy Evans went to the police in Merthyr Tydfil, Wales, and claimed that his wife had died after drinking a poisonous solution Christie had given her for the abortion. He insisted her death was an accident and that Christie had offered to dispose of the body. Evans also stated that Geraldine was being cared for by someone in London. Police initially dismissed Evans' account, but eventually searched 10 Rillington Place. A cursory examination revealed nothing. However, a more thorough search uncovered the bodies of Beryl, Geraldine and a male fetus in the washhouse. Beryl had been strangled, and Geraldine had been killed in the same manner. The findings painted a harrowing picture of a young mother and her infant daughter's violent death. Timothy Evans' trial for the murder of Geraldine began on January 11th, 1950. The case against him rested heavily on his own inconsistent statements and the testimony of John Christie, who positioned himself as a credible and reliable witness. The jury swiftly convicted Evans, and despite his appeals and his insistence that Christie was the true culprit, Evans was hanged on March 9th, 1950. The investigation into the murders was plagued by incompetence and a lack of forensic rigour. The failure to uncover the remains of Christie's earlier victims in the garden and the superficial nature of the searches allowed Christie to continue his killing spree. Police also relied heavily on Christie's testimony, ignoring his prior criminal record and the suspicious details surrounding his involvement with the Evans family. Timothy Evans' tragic story remains a cautionary tale about the perils of systemic failures and wrongful convictions. Christie's eventual confessions to multiple murders, including those of Beryl and Geraldine, would not only exonerate Evans posthumously, but also expose the horrific scale of Christie's crimes. After Timothy Evans' trial and execution, life at 10 Rillington Place quieted down for nearly 3 years. Christie found work as a clerk at British Road Services Shepherd's Bush Depot starting the 12th of June 1950. Meanwhile, the empty first and second floor flats at 10 Rillington Place were let to new tenants, predominantly migrants from the West Indies. This development deeply unsettled both Christie and his wife Ethel, who were both openly racist and resented the presence of their new neighbours. Tensions between the Christies and the tenants eventually escalated. Ethel even brought one of the neighbours to court for assault. Despite the strained relations, Christie took steps to maintain his exclusive use of the garden, ostensibly as a way to preserve some distance from the other residents. However, it's likely his motivation was to prevent anyone from disturbing the ground where the remains of his earlier victims were buried. He enlisted the services of the Poor Man's Lawyer Centre to secure this arrangement. On the 14th of December 1952, Christie strangled his wife Ethel while she lay in bed. Her last known public appearance had been 2 days before. After the murder, Christie wove a web of lies to explain her absence. To concerned relatives in Sheffield, he claimed that she was too unwell to write letters. To neighbours, he offered varying accounts. She was visiting family in Sheffield or in Birmingham. By this time, Christie's financial situation had become increasingly precarious. He had resigned from his job at the Shepherd's Bush Depot on the 6th of December 1952, which left him unemployed. In the days following Ethel's murder, he began selling her belongings to make ends meet. On the 17th of December, he sold her a wedding ring and a watch for a mere £2.10. Over the following weeks, he continued to sell her furniture, clothing and other items from their home. Christie also exploited Ethel's bank account. He forged her signature to withdraw the remaining balance. Between these small acts of fraud and the sale of possessions, Christie cobbled together enough money to survive for a time, alongside his weekly unemployment benefits. However, despite his desperation and isolation steadily growing, setting the stage for horrifying events that would soon follow. Between the 19th of January and the 6th of March 1953, John Christie committed 3 more murders, claiming the lives of Kathleen Maloney, Rita Nelson and Ectorina McLennan. Kathleen Maloney was a sex worker from the Ladbroke Grove area. Maloney was lured into Christie's flat under false pretences. Rita Nelson, visiting her sister in Ladbroke Grove. Nelson was 6 months pregnant when she encountered Christie. Ectorina McLennan. Christie first met McLennan, who was living in London with her boyfriend Alex Baker at a cafe. He formed a rapport with the couple, even allowing them to stay at 10 Rillington Place temporarily while they searched for housing. Christie later persuaded McLennan to visit his flat alone, where he murdered her. When Baker came looking for her, Christie convincingly denied having seen her. He even feigned concern and joined Baker in searching for her in the days that followed. For these murders, Christie adapted his earlier gassing technique, using a rubber tube connected to the kitchen gas pipe. He would release carbon monoxide into the room while his victims were seated. The gas rendered them drowsy, at which point he strangled them with a length of rope. Although Christie claims to have perfected this method, later reports questioned his account, suggesting that he himself would have been affected by the gas. All 3 victims showed evidence of carbon monoxide exposure in addition to strangulation. Christie essayed his victims while they were unconscious and continued during the act of murder. These actions, once publicly revealed, branded him as a necrophiliac. However, some experts have argued that Christie's essays occurred primarily during the process of killing rather than afterwards, complicating this categorisation. After killing his victims, Christie wrapped their semi-nude bodies in blankets, inserting a cloth-like material between their legs. He then concealed the corpses in a small alcove behind the kitchen wall. This method mirrored the way he had disposed of Beryl Evans' body years earlier. To hide the alcove, Christie covered its entrance with wallpaper. Christie moved out of 10 Rillington Place on the 20th of March 1953, fraudulently subletting the flat to an unsuspecting couple for £7.13. That same evening, the landlord discovered the deception and demanded the couple vacate the property the following morning. 4 days later, on the 24th of March, the tenant of the top floor flat, Beresford Brown, was granted access to Christie's former kitchen. While attempting to install brackets for a wireless, Brown inadvertently uncovered the alcove hidden behind the wallpaper. To his horror, he discovered the bodies of Maloney, Nelson and McLennan. Seeking confirmation from another tenant that they were indeed human remains, Brown immediately alerted the police. A citywide manhunt for Christie ensued, sparking panic and revulsion throughout London, as the gruesome discoveries at 10 Rillington Place were made public. The police launched an intensive search for John Christie following the discovery of the bodies. His description and photograph were circulated widely. Christie, however, had been living rough since leaving 10 Rillington Place, moving between doss houses and wandering the streets of London. On the 31st of March 1953, a week after the bodies was found, Christie was arrested near Putney Bridge by a constable who recognised him from the circulated descriptions. At the time of his arrest, Christie appeared dishevelled and unkempt, a stark contrast to the calm and collected image he had previously maintained. During his initial interrogation, Christie admitted to the murders of Maloney, Nelson and McLennan, as well as his wife Ethel. The police uncovered even more horrifying details as Christie began confessing to additional crimes, including the murders of Beryl and Geraldine Evans. His confessions, however, were selective and self-serving, designed to shift blame and downplay his true depravity. As the investigation into Christie's crimes deepened, police thoroughly examined the property at 10 Rillington Place. They unearthed more remains, including Ruth First and Muriel Eady. The skeletal remains of these earlier victims were found buried in the back garden. The discoveries confirmed Christie's long history of violence and deceit. The scale and nature of the murders shocked both the police and the public, revealing him as one of Britain's most notorious serial killers. The horrifying story of John Christie came to an end with his execution on the 15th of July 1953, but its ramifications echoed far beyond that date. Christie's calculated deceit, his ability to exploit the vulnerability of his victims, and the systemic failures that allowed his crimes to go unchecked for so long left an indelible stain on British justice. The tragic and wrongful conviction and execution of Timothy Evans exposed critical flaws in the judicial system and heightened public awareness of its fallibility. The discovery that an innocent man had been hanged for crimes committed by Christie played a significant role in the eventual abolition of the death penalty in the UK. This case remains a chilling reminder of how a combination of manipulative cunning, institutional errors and societal blind spots can allow a predator to thrive unchecked. Number 10 Rillington Place itself became infamous, synonymous with the unspeakable acts committed there. The property was eventually demolished in the 1970s as the neighbourhood underwent redevelopment, but its dark history endures in the public imagination. The Christie murders serve as a grim warning about the dangers of unchecked power and the critical importance of ensuring justice is both thorough and fair. His case is studied to this day, not only as an example of extreme human depravity, but also as a sobering lesson in the consequences of systemic failure.